Well, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya had no political experience until she ran for the presidency. The 37-year-old stay-at-home mother and former teacher and interpreter never wanted to be a politician and says she still doesn't. In the build-up to the election, 3 leading opposition figures were forced into exile or arrested, including her husband, Sergei Tikhanovsky. Svetlana decided to run in his place. She joined forces with other campaigns, uniting the opposition behind a simple promise to hold free and fair elections within 6 months, with no one barred from running. Tens of thousands of people turned up to Tikhanovskaya's rallies, the biggest since the fall of the Soviet Union, proving she had mass support. But on election day, the official results, which critics say were rigged, gave her just 10% of the vote. She claims she won between 60 and 70%. She was then detained after trying to register a complaint about the result and later fled to Lithuania, from where she spoke to my colleague.
I'm going back to Belarus. I want to go back to Belarus. I adore my country, and I will go there when I will feel safe.
Do you not feel safe where you are today?
No, I'm safe here in Lithuania, but I don't feel safe in Belarus now.
Do you fear for your husband who's back in Belarus?
For sure, I do fear for my husband, the same as I'm worrying about all the Belarusian people who are there struggling for their rights.
You're urging your supporters now to step up strike, despite intimidation. I mean, you yourself fled Belarus because you didn't feel safe, as you've said. President Lukashenko right now shows no sign of backing down. Nearly 2 weeks after this election was held, he's even vowed to crush the unrest in the coming days. Are you not concerned that there could be more violence and more bloodshed if the movement continues?
That violence that our authorities showed to the Russian people, I consider to be their greatest mistake ever. And I call for authorities not to repeat this mistake, because our people, they will never forget and forgive this to our president.
But what about your movement? What's your message to the people who are still taking to the streets, even if in smaller numbers? If the protests turn violent again, will you order them to stop?
I can't order anything to the Russian people. It's only their own decision.
Well, now, of course, our other top story has been the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny being transferred to a hospital in the German capital, Berlin, this to receive emergency specialist treatment for suspected poisoning. Now, Navalny's evacuation was initially delayed by Russian doctors who said he was too sick to be moved from a hospital in the Siberian city of Omsk. But they then changed their position on this late on Friday after he was seen by German doctors. Dominic Kane reports.
This is where Alexei Navalny's journey has brought him, Berlin's world-renowned Charité hospital. And the start of treatment his supporters hope will save the life of one of Russia's most prominent dissidents. He was brought here on board a special flight from Siberia. The man whose group arranged the journey says Navalny's condition remains poor.
Basically, it's very worrying. We're all happy that he's landed safely here in Berlin. But it doesn't mean anything in itself, because his physical condition is still of concern. It's clear that if his original flight hadn't made the emergency landing in Omsk when it did, he would have died.
Staff here have immediate, relevant, recent experience of treating patients with the sorts of symptoms that Alexei Navalny has come here with. Now they get the chance to find out what exactly is in his system and how they go about removing it. But how it got there in the first place remains unclear. Navalny's friends and family believe he drank tea that had been poisoned just before he boarded a flight to Tomsk. They say officials in Russia then deliberately delayed his transfer to Berlin to allow time for whatever was in his system to degrade, making it harder to identify. The authorities at the Russian hospital where he was treated deny this.
We have come to the conclusion that, judging by the fact that there were no poisons found in his blood or other biological materials, he has a metabolic disorder, lowering of blood sugar levels to be specific, due to a rapid change of pressure. Everyone thinks it was during takeoff.
Alexei Navalny is well known for his fight against corruption in his country. But right now his fight is just to survive. Dominic Kane, Al Jazeera, Berlin.
Well, Michael Bosicki is a global affairs analyst and joins me now over Skype from Ottawa. So Navalny is finally in Berlin at hospital, and of course he's having these tests that are being conducted by German doctors. How closely is everyone watching for the diagnosis?
Oh, very closely. I mean, what happened does fit a Putin pattern of intimidating his critics. And of course, Navalny is the #1 critic. This sends a very chilling signal yet again that the long arm of the Kremlin can hit anybody either in Russia or outside of Russia. And by the way, Miriam, I just had to add, I just heard the interview with Svetlana, and to me, that sounded like someone who is very afraid and very intimidated about coming back to a country which has the very long tentacles of the Russian Secret Service in it. So that in itself also is very chilling.
Just on the point about Navalny, even if a poisoning diagnosis is confirmed, it's very difficult, isn't it, even with an investigation, to figure out who did it, particularly as someone like Navalny. I mean, you know, he spoke out against oligarchs, against businessmen, against all types of corruption. He had opponents outside of the Kremlin as well.
Yes, he did. Well, first of all, about the opponents outside of the Kremlin, I think there's also a pattern, Miriam, of vigilantes or people loyal to the Kremlin doing acts on their own. So this could have been that. But in terms of finding out what exactly happened, I mean, I refer you back to the case of Viktor Yushchenko, the former Ukrainian president, who was poisoned by his own Ukrainian security service, which was infiltrated by the Russians. That never really was solved, but it took months and months of therapy and of treatment, and he's still recovering to this day. So these are very, very horrible things to happen to people who are, you know, used to being on the front lines and used to being critics.
Now, you were mentioning the interview earlier with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and she has been very vocal, really speaking to many different people in the past 24 hours. She was saying that she will never forget the violence, the arrests, the torture that people have suffered since that disputed presidential election. But I suppose the fear in the country now is that it might all have been for nothing if President Lukashenko continues to dig his heels in.
Yeah, and I'm very worried about that because right now for autocrats like, you know, their Belarusian president Lukashenko, and for people like Putin, the geopolitics, if you will, are very fertile ground for them. And what I mean by that, there's a U.S. election coming up. There's a U.S. president who is indifferent to autocrats. The world is distracted by COVID-19. We have a dysfunctional U.S. Congress, and that's important to mention because they are the ones who approve more funding and back up sanctions. And we have a very, very emboldened President Putin. So for you know, these harsh tactics to be employed and for very little response from the West, that's what we can expect. And just quickly, if I can, I spoke recently to Ambassador Bill Taylor, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, and I asked him what is in Mr. Putin's mind, and he said, well, we don't know, but we should be prepared for anything. And to deter further Russian aggression, the sanctions toolbox is by no means empty.
Without a clear political plan or roadmap, though, for the opposition, will the protests just lose momentum?
I don't think so. I think the public there in Belarus are entirely fed up, especially with corruption and especially with the government's handling. It was a debacle of the COVID-19 crisis. And, you know, we have to remember that basically the protest movement in Hong Kong and to a certain extent in Iran and even in Belarus are kind of leaderless. And in this age of social media, people being able to gather almost on the spur of the moment through social media is a very, very different playing field, a very unfamiliar playing field for these autocrats. So that's something they have to deal with these days, and they're not very used to it.
Michael Bosicki, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
You're at the News Hour live from London. Much more still to tell you about. Thousands of lightning strikes ignite some of the largest wildfires in California's history. The Syrian migrants who were injured in Beirut's deadly port explosion now left to fend for themselves. And then later in sport, England's new cricket stars rack up records. Peter will have those details.